The autumn wind carried voices through the clapboard walls of the general store, and Eleanor Whitehead heard every word. She stood perfectly still behind a tower of flour sacks, her basket growing heavy in her hands, listening to the women who had once been her friends dissect her life with the surgical precision of vultures picking at bones. I heard she was seen walking alone past the saloon at dusk. Mrs. Holmes's voice dripped with practiced scandal. Alone, mind you. What respectable woman has business on that side of town after dark? Perhaps the same kind who would show her face in church after what she did, Mrs. Caldwell added, and Eleanor could hear the rustle of her skirts, could picture her leaning in close to deliver the killing blow, abandoning her husband's memory before he's been cold in the ground a full year. Shameful. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the basket handle until her knuckles went white. The late October sun slanted through the store's dusty windows, illuminating motes that danced like the ashes of her former life. 6 months had passed since Thomas died, and in that time, she had watched her place in the community crumble like dry bread into desperate hands. She had been Thomas Whitehead, respected, included, safe. Now she was simply the widow, and worse, the widow who dared to continue living. I saw her speaking with that drifter who's been working at the Larson Ranch. A third voice joined in, younger, eager, Miss Pritchard, barely 20, and hungry for inclusion among the matrons. Speaking to him right there on Main Street, bold as brass. The drifter. They meant Mr. Cole, the quiet man who had arrived in Robertson Springs 3 weeks ago, looking for work and nothing more. Eleanor had spoken to him exactly once, to ask him to move a broken wagon wheel that had fallen into the pathway outside the boarding house where she took in mending. He had tipped his hat, moved the wheel, and walked away without a word. But in a town where widows were expected to drape themselves in perpetual mourning and speak to no man save the minister, even that brief exchange had become fodder for destruction. "Well, what can you expect?" Mrs. Holmes's voice dropped to a stage whisper that somehow carried farther than her normal tone. "I've heard things about her marriage. About why Thomas was always so troubled." Eleanor felt the words like a blade between her ribs. Thomas had been troubled. Yes, but not because of her. He had returned from the war with demons that clawed at him in the night, that made him wake screaming, that drove him to the bottle, and then to the fever that finally took him. She had nursed him through it all, had held him when he wept, had spoken gently when he raged at ghosts only he could see, and she had loved him, despite everything, until the very end. My Henry says, a woman like that, she's got a darkness in her, Mrs. Caldwell continued. Says she probably drove poor Thomas to an early grave with her ways. Eleanor set the basket down carefully on the rough wooden floor. Her hands were shaking now, and she pressed them against her worn skirt, feeling the patches she had sewn herself, the places where the fabric had grown thin from washing and wearing and making do. She had come to the store for lamp oil and coffee, both of which she needed desperately, but she could not make herself walk around the tower of flour sacks and face those women. Could not bear to see their eyes slide away from hers, to watch them gather their skirts, as if her very presence might contaminate them. The bell above the door jangled, and heavy footsteps crossed the floor. Mal footsteps, measured and sure. "Good afternoon, ladies." The voice was deep, warm, touched with the rounded vowels of education. Reverend Samuel Moseley had been the minister of Robertson Springs Community Church for 2 years now, having come from somewhere back east after his own wife passed. "I hope this fine day finds you well." The women's voices shifted immediately, climbing to pitches of artificial sweetness. Eleanor closed her eyes, wishing she could disappear into the floorboards, become dust and shadow, and nothing more. "Reverend Moseley, what a pleasant surprise," Mrs. Holmes cooed. "We were just discussing the unfortunate state of morals in our community. Is that so?" Something in the Reverend's tone made Eleanor open her eyes. She could not see him from her hiding place, but she could hear the subtle steel beneath his courtesy. "I find the morals of this community to be quite sound, generally speaking, though I confess I sometimes worry about the quality of our Christian charity." A pause. pregnant with confusion. "I'm sure I don't understand your meaning, Reverend," Mrs. Caldwell said carefully. "Don't you?" The footsteps moved, floorboards creaking. "I was walking past just now and couldn't help but overhear your conversation. The walls here are quite thin, you understand. And I found myself troubled by what I heard." Eleanor's breath caught. He had heard. The Reverend had heard them tearing her apart, and now he was here, and she could not decide if that made everything better or infinitely worse. "We were simply concerned," Miss Pritchard offered, her voice uncertain, "about Mrs. Whitehead, about her reputation." Her reputation. The Reverend's footsteps stopped. "Tell me, ladies, what exactly has Mrs. Whitehead done to deserve your concern?" Silence stretched like taffy, sticky and uncomfortable. "Well, that is, there have been questions about her conduct," Mrs. Holmes finally ventured. "A widow should be more careful about appearances." "I see. And what conduct, specifically, troubles you?" "She was seen speaking to that drifter," Miss Pritchard said quickly. "Mr. Cole, alone." "Ah, yes, I witnessed that conversation myself." Whitehead asked Mr. Cole to move a wagon wheel that was blocking the boarding house path. He did so, and then continued on his way. The entire exchange lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Is there something inappropriate about asking for help with a task beyond one's physical strength? More silence. Eleanor pressed her hand to her mouth, hardly daring to breathe. "There are other concerns," Mrs. Caldwell said, and Eleanor could hear the edge in her voice now. The defensiveness of someone whose righteousness has been questioned. Her behavior during her marriage. The way Thomas changed. The drinking. Thomas Whitehead came home from the war with wounds that no doctor could treat, Reverend Moseley said quietly. And now there was no warmth in his voice at all, only a cold clarity that made Eleanor think of winter stars. He suffered from terrors of the mind that many soldiers endure. His widow nursed him with a devotion that humbled me every time I visited their home. She sat with him through the worst of his nightmares. She kept him clean and fed when the fever came. She held his hand as he died, and wept over his grave with a grief so profound that I worried for her health. And now, 6 months later, when she has finally begun to emerge from that darkness, when she has started to take in mending to support herself, because Thomas left her with nothing but debts, you three stand in this store and savage her name for the crime of speaking to a man about a wagon wheel? Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. He had seen all those visits to their small house on the edge of town. The Reverend had seen everything, and he had understood. "We didn't. That is, we meant no harm," Mrs. Holmes stammered. "We were only—" "You were gossiping," Reverend Moseley cut her off. "And not merely gossiping, but actively working to destroy the reputation of a woman who has already lost nearly everything. Tell me, have any of you offered to help Mrs. Whitehead? Have you brought her a meal, offered her work, included her in your charitable societies?" No answer came. "I thought not. Instead, you've whispered about her, shunned her, made her an outcast in a very community that should have rallied around her in her time of need. And you call yourselves Christian women." "Reverend Moseley, I must protest," Mrs. Caldwell began, her voice tight with offense. "You cannot speak to us this way. We are pillars of this church. My husband is on the board of elders. I have served on every committee for 15 years. And yet you have failed to serve the widow and the orphan, which is what James calls us to do. You have failed to love your neighbor as yourself, which is what Christ commanded. All your committees and all your respectability mean nothing if you lack compassion." Eleanor heard the rustle of skirts, sharp and angry. "I will not be lectured like a common sinner," Mrs. Holmes said. "Come, ladies, let us leave the Reverend to his convictions." The footsteps moved toward the door, quick and furious. The bell jangled once, twice, 3 times, and then silence fell over the store like snow. Eleanor remained frozen behind the flour sacks, her heart hammering against her ribs. She heard the Reverend's footsteps moving slowly through the store, heard him speak quietly to Miss Patterson, the store owner, heard the clink of coins, and then, impossibly, his footsteps came toward her hiding place. "Miss Whitehead," he said gently, and she realized with a flood of shame that he had known she was there all along. "I believe you came here to make some purchases. Ease, don't let those women drive you away." She could not move, could not make her legs work or her voice function. She stood there like a pillar of salt, unable to face him after what he had done, unable to express the gratitude and humiliation had warred inside her chest. "I understand," he continued, his voice still gentle. "It's difficult, but I want you to know something, Mrs. Whitehead. You have done nothing wrong. Do you hear me? Nothing? You are a woman of virtue and strength, and anyone who says otherwise will answer to me." The tears spilled over then, tracking hot paths down her cheeks. She heard him move away, heard the bell jangle as he left, and only then did she allow herself to sink down onto a sack of grain, her whole body shaking with sobs she had held back for 6 long months. Mr. Patterson appeared around the corner, his weathered face creased with concern. He was an older man, kind, a widower himself. "Mrs. Whitehead," he said quietly, "are you all right?" She nodded, wiping her eyes with her worn handkerchief. "Yes, thank you. I just need a moment." He nodded and disappeared, and Eleanor sat there in the dust and shadows, trying to gather the pieces of herself back together. The Reverend's words echoed in her mind, solid and sure, a foundation where everything else had turned to sand beneath her feet. He had defended her. Not just defended her, but done so with a fierce conviction that stunned her. She barely knew him, had spoken to him only in passing, and yet he had seen her suffering and called it by its name. She finally rose and made her way to the counter. Mr. Patterson had already set out the lamp oil and coffee, along with a small package of sugar she had not asked for. "The Reverend paid for these," he said, holding up a hand when she started to protest. "And the sugar is from me. My wife would have wanted you to have it." Eleanor's throat tightened again, but she managed to thank him. She gathered her purchases and stepped out into the afternoon sun, blinking against the brightness. The street was quiet, most folks already home starting their supper preparations. She walked slowly toward the boarding house, her mind churning. The boarding house stood at the edge of town, a narrow 2-story building that had seen better days. Miss McCoy, the owner, was a stern woman with a soft heart, and she had given Eleanor a tiny room under the eaves in exchange for mending and laundry. It was not much, but it was shelter, and Eleanor had learned not to take such things for granted. She climbed the narrow stairs to her room, set her packages on the small table by the window, and sank onto the bed. Through the thin walls, she could hear the sounds of the house settling, the creak of floorboards, the murmur of voices from the rooms below. She had never felt so alone, and yet so strangely anchored at the same time. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay in the darkness, watching the shadows shift across the ceiling, thinking about the Reverend's words. Why had he done it? What did he gain by defending her so publicly, so fiercely? He had made enemies of 3 the most influential women in the church, women whose husbands had money and power. He had risked his own position for a widow who had nothing to offer him in return. The question haunted her through the long hours until dawn. Sunday came with a cold wind that promised winter. Eleanor dressed carefully in her one good black dress, the one she had worn to Thomas's funeral and every Sunday since. She pinned her dark hair back severely, checked her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand, and tried to quiet the anxiety that fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird. She had not missed a Sunday service since coming to Robertson Springs 5 years ago, even in the depths of her grief, even when Thomas was at his worst. She had found her way to that small church, had sat in the back pew and sought whatever comfort she could find in the familiar hymns and scripture readings. But this Sunday felt different. This Sunday, everyone would know about the confrontation in the store. The church ladies would have spent the entire week spreading their version of events, and Eleanor walked through those doors knowing that every eye would be on her. She almost stayed home, almost let fear and shame keep her in her little room under the eaves. But something in Reverend Moseley's words had lit a small, stubborn flame inside her. "You've done nothing wrong." She repeated those words to herself as she pulled on her threadbare coat, as she descended the stairs, as she walked through the cold morning toward the white church with its modest steeple. The church stood on a small rise at the center of town, surrounded by ancient oaks that blazed gold and crimson in the autumn light. Wagons and horses filled the yard, and clusters of people gathered on the steps, chatting before the service began. Eleanor saw them all turn to look as she approached, saw the whispers start like ripples in a pond. She kept her head high and her steps steady, though her heart felt like it might beat its way out of her chest. Miss Holmes stood near the door with her husband, a large man who owned the grain warehouse. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Mrs. Holmes's lips pressed into a thin line before she turned deliberately away. Mrs. Caldwell and her husband, the banker, did the same. Miss Pritchard, standing with her parents, at least had the grace to look uncomfortable. Eleanor climbed the steps and entered the church. The familiar smell of old wood and candle wax enveloped her, and for a moment she felt steadier. She moved toward her usual place in the back, but a voice stopped her. "Mrs. Whitehead." Reverend Moseley stood near the front, his tall frame clothed in his simple black suit. "Would you do me the honor of sitting near the front this morning? I find that the back pews can be quite drafty, and I'd hate for you to catch a chill." The church had gone absolutely silent. Eleanor felt every eye on her, felt the weight of judgment and curiosity pressing against her skin. The Reverend's eyes were kind, steady, offering her a choice but also offering something else, something she could not quite name. She made her decision a heartbeat. "Thank you, Reverend. That's very kind." She walked down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing in the silence, and took a seat in the third pew from the front. Reverend Moseley nodded and smiled, then moved to greet others as they entered. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap and stared at the simple wooden cross that hung behind the pulpit, willing herself to breathe normally. As the church filled, she felt people taking seats behind her, heard the whispers that started and stopped like grasshoppers in summer grass. But no one sat in her pew. The space around her remained empty, a visible marker of her isolation. And then, just as the organist began the opening hymn, someone slid into the pew beside her. Eleanor glanced over and was shocked to see Mrs. McCoy, her landlady, settling her considerable bulk onto the bench. The older woman caught her eye and gave a small, firm nod, as if to say, "Let them talk." A moment later, Patterson from the general store took a seat on Eleanor's other side, his weathered face serene. And then, to Eleanor's absolute astonishment, Miss Cole, the drifter, entered the church and sat directly behind her, his presence solid and quiet. The organist finished the introduction, and the congregation rose to sing. Eleanor's voice shook on the first few words, but then steadied. She sang the old hymn of grace and redemption, and felt something snap open inside her chest, something that had been locked tight since the day Thomas died. Reverend Moseley's sermon that morning was on woman caught in adultery, on how Jesus had defended her against the stones of the righteous. He spoke with quiet passion about the difference between judgment and mercy, about the call to love rather than condemn. He never once looked at Mrs. Holmes or Miss Caldwell or any of the others who had spoken against Eleanor, but everyone in that church knew exactly what he was saying and why. When the service ended, Eleanor found herself surrounded by the small group who had sat with her. Mrs. McCoy patted her arm. "You'll take Sunday dinner with me today," she announced. "No arguments." Mr. Patterson nodded. "And I've been meaning to ask if we might have time to mend some shirts for me. My stitching isn't what it used to be." Mr. Cole simply tipped his hat and said, "Ma'am," before walking out into the cold sunlight. Una watched him go. This stranger who had somehow become part of her defense, without saying more than a handful of words. She turned to thank Mrs. McCoy, Haberson, but found her voice had deserted her again. "No need for thanks," Mrs. McCoy said gruffly. "Just doing what's right. Should have done it sooner." As they walked out together, Eleanor saw the church ladies gathered in their usual cluster, their faces tight with disapproval and something else, something that looked almost like uncertainty. Reverend Moseley stood on the church steps, shaking hands and greeting his congregation with his usual warmth. When Eleanor passed, he took her hand gently. "I'm glad you came," he said quietly. "And I hope you'll continue to come. This is your church as much as anyone's." "Thank you," she managed, "for everything." He held her gaze for a moment, and Eleanor saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch, a depth of understanding that went beyond mere sympathy. Then he released her hand and turned to greet the next person, and Eleanor continued down the steps with her small band of unlikely allies. That afternoon, sitting at McCoy's table and eating the first real meal she had shared with anyone in months, Eleanor felt the world shift slightly on its axis. The food was simple, but plentiful: roast chicken and potatoes and green beans from Mrs. McCoy's garden, and the conversation was easy, touching on weather and town news, and nothing of consequence. But beneath it all, Eleanor felt the presence of something she had thought lost to her forever: community, belonging, the simple grace of being seen and accepted. As the autumn light faded, and she walked back to her little room under the eaves, Eleanor found herself thinking not about the women who had rejected her, but about the ones who had stood beside her. And she thought about Reverend Moseley, about the steel in his gentle voice, when he had defended her honor, about the way he had looked at her in the church, as if she were not a burden or a scandal, but simply a person worthy of dignity and respect. Why had he done it? The question still troubled her, but now it carried a different weight. Perhaps, she thought, some people simply chose kindness because it was right, because they could not do otherwise, and still be true to themselves. Perhaps grace, real grace, looked like a minister standing in a general store and calling gossip by its name. Perhaps redemption came not in grand gestures, but in small acts of courage, in choosing to sit beside someone when everyone else turned away. She lit her lamp and sat by the window, taking up the mending she had brought home from the store. Her needle moved in and out of the fabric, creating order from small tears and worn places, making whole what had been broken. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, cold and distant and beautiful. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own small battles for dignity and survival. But tonight, Eleanor allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in a very long time. Tonight, she allowed herself to feel hope. Sunday morning arrived with a kind of golden light that made everything look touched by grace. Eleanor dressed with particular care, though she told herself it had nothing to do with Samuel's confession a night before. She pinned her hair back in the usual severe style, but at the last moment, she softened it slightly, allowing a few tendrils to frame her face. It was a small vanity, but it felt like an act of courage nonetheless. The walk to church took her past the general store, where Mr. Patterson was sweeping the front steps. He paused and nodded to her, a gesture of acknowledgement that would have been unremarkable anywhere else, but felt significant here, in this town, where she had been invisible for so long. She nodded back and continued on, her heart beating faster with each step that brought her closer to the white church on the hill. The congregation was already gathering, clusters of families and individuals moving toward the doors. Eleanor saw the usual faces, the usual patterns of greeting and conversation. But something was different this morning. Several people who had previously avoided her gaze now offered small smiles or nods. Mrs. Patterson waved from across the yard. Even the Larson family, wealthy ranchers who normally kept to themselves, acknowledged her presence with polite courtesy. Miss Caldwell and her allies stood in their customary spot near the entrance, a fortress of righteousness and disapproval. Una felt their eyes on her as she climbed the steps, felt the weight of their judgment like a physical thing, but she kept her head high and walked through the doors into the sanctuary. She moved toward the third pew from the front, the place that had somehow become hers after Samuel's invitation the previous week. But before she could sit, a voice stopped her. "Miss Whitehead, would you care to join us?" Mrs. Patterson stood in a pew closer to the middle, her husband beside her, gesturing to the empty space next to them. Eleanor hesitated, surprised by the invitation, then moved to join them. As she settled into the pew, she noticed other people filling in around her. Not a complete acceptance, not yet, but no longer the empty space that had marked her as untouchable. It was progress, small but undeniable. Samuel entered from the side door as the organist began the opening hymn. His eyes found Eleanor immediately, and something passed between them. A recognition had made her pulse quicken. He took his place at the pulpit and led the congregation through the familiar rituals of worship, his voice steady and sure. But Eleanor thought she detected an undercurrent of emotion beneath the professional polish. His sermon that morning was about the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman, who had been married 5 times and was living with a man not her husband. He spoke about how Jesus had not condemned her but had offered her living water, had seen past her circumstances to the person she truly was. He spoke about the difference between the shame that society imposes and the grace that God offers, about how we are called to extend that same grace to one another. Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks as she listened. This was not just a sermon. It was a declaration, a continuing defense of her right to dignity and new beginnings. And as she looked around the sanctuary, she saw that she was not the only one moved. Several other women were dabbing at their eyes, and even some of the men looked contemplative, rather than bored. Mrs. Caldwell sat ramrod straight, her face a mask of displeasure, but Eleanor noticed that the women around her seemed less unified this morning, less certain in their righteousness. Holmes kept glancing at Eleanor, her expression troubled rather than condemning. Even Miss Pritchard looked thoughtful, as if perhaps she was beginning to question the narrative she had been fed. After the service, Eleanor lingered in her pew as others filed out. She needed a moment to compose herself, to process the emotions that Samuel's sermon had stirred up. When she finally rose to leave, she found him waiting near the door, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries with his departing congregation. Their eyes met as she approached, and he took her hand in both of his. "Mrs. Whitehead," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears only. "Thank you for being here." "Thank you for that sermon," she replied, equally quiet. "It was exactly what I needed to hear." His hands tightened briefly around hers before releasing. "Would you do me the honor of taking a walk with me this afternoon? There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Eleanor's heart stuttered. A walk? In full view of the entire town, completely proper and above reproach, he assured her with a slight smile. "But I think it's time we stopped hiding what's happening between us. If we're going to pursue this, whatever this is, we should do so honestly." The boldness of the suggestions took her breath away. "Samuel, people will talk. People are already talking. At least this way, they have something real to talk about, rather than invented scandal." He paused. "Unless you'd prefer to wait, I don't want to rush you into anything you're not ready for." Eleanor looked at him, at this man who had defended her honor and declared his feelings, and was now proposing to walk openly beside her, despite the certain backlash. She thought about Thomas, about the years of suffering and slow loss, about the woman she had been then, and the woman she was becoming now, and she made her choice. "I would be honored to walk with you, Reverend Moseley." His smile was like sunrise. "Shall we say 3 o'clock? I'll call for you at the boarding house." As Eleanor walked home, she felt as if she were floating several inches above the ground. Mrs. McCoy took one look at her face and laughed. "So he's courting you proper now, is he?" "He's asked me to take a walk with him this afternoon. In public, I assume, where all the gossips can see?" "Yes." Mrs. McCoy nodded approvingly. "Smart man. He's forcing the issue, and he's is honorable, and his intentions serious. The church ladies will have a fit, but they can't argue with proper courtship." Eleanor sank into a chair, the enormity of what was happening finally hitting her. "Mrs. McCoy, what am I doing? It's too soon. People will say terrible things." "People are already saying terrible things," Mrs. McCoy pointed out. "At least now you'll have something worth withering their disapproval for." She sat across from Eleanor, her expression turning serious. "Listen to me, girl. I've lived a long time. And I've learned that happiness doesn't wait for convenient timing. If you care for this man, if he cares for you, then to heck what the calendar says or what the gossips think. You've earned the right to find joy wherever you can get it. Eleanor nodded, trying to absorb the wisdom. I'm still frightened. Good. That means you're not taking it lightly. Mrs. McCoy stood. Now go make yourself presentable. And Eleanor, wear something other than black. You're not dead, and neither is your future. At 3 o'clock precisely, Samuel arrived at the boarding house, wearing his Sunday suit and carrying his hat. Eleanor met him in a parlor dressed in a dark blue dress that she had not worn since before Thomas's illness. It had taken her 20 minutes to decide to put it on. 20 minutes of staring at the cheerful color and wondering if it was a betrayal. But when Samuel saw her, his face lit with such obvious admiration that her doubts quieted. "You look lovely," he said simply. They walked out into the afternoon sunshine, with Miss McCoy watching from the window, a satisfied smile on her face. The streets of Robertson Springs were busy with the post-church Sunday traffic, families heading home from dinner, children playing in yards, men gathered outside the feed store discussing weather and crops. And every single person they passed noticed Eleanor walking beside the minister. Samuel kept proper distance, not touching her except to offer his arm when they navigated a muddy patch in the road. But his presence beside her was steady and sure, and the message was clear to anyone watching. This was not a pastoral visit or casual encounter. This was a man and a woman spending time together by choice, in full view of the community. They walked toward the edge of town, where a small creek ran through a grove of cottonwoods. The trees were bare now, their leaves carpeting the ground in shades of gold and brown, but the place held a peaceful beauty nonetheless. Samuel led her to a fallen log that had been worn smooth by time and weather, and they sat, watching the water flow past. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," Samuel began, "about all your fears and concerns, and I want to address each one, if you'll let me." Eleanor nodded, her hands folded in her lap. "First, the concern that this is too soon after your husband's death. Eleanor, I've been a minister for 8 years now, and I've counseled many widows and widowers. I've learned that grief is not a linear process with a clear endpoint. Some people are ready to move forward after a few months. Others take years. The only timeline that matters is yours, and if you feel ready to explore a connection with me, then no one else's opinion on the matter should hold any weight." He paused, picking up a smooth stone and turning it over in his hands. "Second, the concern about what people will say. I won't lie to you and then pretend that our courtship won't cause talk. It absolutely will. Mrs. Caldwell and her circle will be scandalized. There will be whispers, and probably some very uncomfortable conversations. But Eleanor, if I've learned anything from losing my own wife, it's that life is too short and too precious to waste living for other people's approval. If we care for each other, if this connection is real and good, then it's worth facing whatever opposition comes our way." Eleanor watched the water, letting his words settle into her heart. "And what about your position? Won't this damage your standing as minister?" "It might," he admitted. "Some people may question my judgment or my propriety. But I've already made my position clear by defending you publicly. I've already chosen you over their good opinion. And honestly, if being a minister means I have to deny my own happiness and yours in order to appease people who value appearances over compassion, then perhaps I'm not the right man for this position anyway." The conviction in his voice moved her deeply. She turned to look at him, this man who was risking so much for her. "You said there was something you wanted to discuss with me. Is this what you meant?" "Partly, but there's more." He set down the stone and faced her fully. "I need you to understand what I'm offering here. This isn't a casual interest or a passing attraction. I'm talking about courtship with the intention of marriage. Eventually, if that's what we both want. I know that's terrifying and probably premature to mention, but I believe in honesty. I'm not interested in anything that doesn't have the potential to go somewhere real and lasting." Eleanor's breath caught. Marriage. The word hung in the air between them, both promise and threat. "Samuel, I don't know if I can be a minister's wife. I don't know if I have the strength for it. especially given how people already view me. You don't have to decide that now. I'm not asking you to marry me today. I'm just asking if you are willing to explore this connection between us, to give us a chance to see where it might lead. He reached out and took her hand, a gesture both tender and bold. But I needed you to know that I'm serious about this, about you. His hand was warm around hers, solid and reassuring. Laura looked down at their joined hands and felt something shift inside her, some final wall crumbling. I'm willing to try, she said quietly. I'm terrified and uncertain, and probably making a huge mistake. But yes, I'm willing to try. His smile was radiant. That's all I ask. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands still joined, watching the water flow past. Eleanor felt a peace settling over her that she had not experienced in years, a sense that perhaps, finally, she was exactly where she was meant to be. Tell me about your wife, she said eventually. I know she died of consumption, but what was she like? Samuel's expression grew distant, touched with remembered sorrow. Catherine was brilliant, sharp as a tack and twice as quick. She could debate theology with seminary professors and make them question everything they thought they knew. She was also kind, genuinely kind, not the performative charity that so many people practice, but real compassion that saw people's pain and wanted to ease it. He paused. She would have liked you, I think. She had no patience for social pretense or people who judged others without cause. I wish I could have known her. I wish you could have, too. But Eleanor, you should know that what I feel for you wasn't a replacement for what I felt for her. It's something new, something different. You're not a substitute. You're your own person, and I care about you for who you are, not because you remind me of someone else. The clarification mattered more than Eleanor had realized it would. Thank you for saying that. I needed to hear it. They walked back to town as the afternoon shadows lengthened, and this time Samuel did not release her hand. They walked through the center of town hand in hand, a declaration and a defiance all at once. Eleanor felt eyes on them from every direction, felt the weight of scrutiny and speculation. But Samuel's grip remained steady, and she found that with him beside her, the stares bothered her less than they might have. As they approached the boarding house, they encountered Miss Caldwell and Mrs. Holmes coming out of the church. The two women stopped short, their faces registering shock, and then outrage at the sight of Eleanor and Samuel walking hand in hand. Reverend Moseley, Mrs. Caldwell said icily. I must say I'm shocked at this display. Surely you cannot believe this is appropriate behavior for a minister. Samuel stopped, and Eleanor felt him draw himself up to his full height. Mrs. Caldwell, I believe what's appropriate is for me to openly court a woman I admire and respect. Miss Whitehead has agreed to allow me to call on her, and we are conducting ourselves with complete propriety. I fail to see what's shocking about two adults spending time together in public. She's a widow barely out of mourning, Mrs. Holmes protested. And you're the minister. People expect better from you. I expect better from people as well, Samuel replied evenly. I expect them to show compassion rather than judgment, to celebrate others' happiness rather than tear it down, to practice the Christianity they profess rather than using it as a weapon against those they deem unworthy. But we don't always get what we expect, do we? Mrs. Caldwell's face had gone red. This is completely unacceptable. I will be speaking to the Board of Elders about this. You cannot simply, I can, and I am, Samuel interrupted. And if the Board of Elders takes issue with me courting a woman of excellent character and virtue, then perhaps they need to examine their own priorities. Now, if you'll excuse us, I'm escorting Miss Whitehead home. He guided Eleanor past the sputtering women, and they did not speak again until they reached the boarding house steps. There, he released her hand reluctantly. I'm sorry you had to witness that, he said, but I meant every word. I won't allow anyone to make you feel ashamed for allowing me to court you. You've made a powerful enemy in Mrs. Caldwell. I made that enemy the day I defended you in the general store. This just confirms it. He smiled slightly. But I've faced worse and disapproving church ladies, Eleanor. I'll survive. That night, Eleanor lay in her bed and replayed every moment of the afternoon. Samuel's words, his hand in hers, the way he had defended their right to explore this connection. And for the first time since Thomas died, she allowed herself to imagine a future that held more than mere survival. She imagined laughter and conversation, shared meals and quiet evenings, the comfort of being known and accepted by another person. She imagined belonging not just to a community but to someone, and having someone belong to her in return. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. Monday brought the promised backlash. Miss McCoy reported that the church ladies were in an uproar, spreading word of Samuel and Eleanor's scandalous hand-holding through town like wildfire. An emergency meeting of the Board of Elders had been called for Wednesday evening to discuss the minister's conduct, and several families had apparently declared they might seek another church if Reverend Moseley continued his association with that woman. Eleanor sat in her little room and tried to work on her mending, but her hands shook and her stitches came out crooked. This was exactly what she had feared, exactly what she had known would happen. Samuel was going to lose his position because of her, and she could not bear the thought of being responsible for destroying his calling. She was considering whether she should end their courtship, for it even really began, when a knock came at her door. Mrs. McCoy entered carrying a letter. "This just came for you," she said, handing over an envelope with Eleanor's name written in unfamiliar handwriting. Eleanor opened it with trembling fingers and read, "Dear Miss Whitehead, we have never been formally introduced, but I have observed you in church and around town for several months now. I am writing to offer my support for your courtship with Reverend Moseley. My husband and I believe that the Reverend has shown excellent judgment in his choice, and we wish to publicly declare our approval of this match. Furthermore, we understand that certain individuals are attempting to create trouble for the Reverend with the Board of Elders. Please know that my husband, who sits on that board, will be speaking in strong support of Reverend Moseley at Wednesday's meeting. We believe that a minister who practices what he preaches about compassion and grace is exactly the kind of spiritual leader this community needs. You are a woman of strength and dignity, Mrs. Whitehead, and anyone who fails to see that is simply not paying attention. Please do not let the cruelty of small minds drive you away from a chance at happiness. With warmest regards, Miss Sarah Larson." Eleanor read the letter 3 times, hardly believing the words. Mrs. Larson, wife of one of the wealthiest and most respected men in Robertson Springs, was publicly supporting her. The weight of that endorsement could not be overstated. More letters arrived. Over the next 2 days, Mrs. Patterson wrote expressing her support. Cole sent a brief note saying simply that he hoped she would continue to hold her head high. Even some people Eleanor barely knew sent messages of encouragement. It seemed that Samuel's sermon on Sunday, combined with his bold declaration of courtship, had shifted something in the town's consciousness. Not everyone approved, certainly, but enough people did that the opposition no longer seemed quite so monolithic. Wednesday evening arrived, and Eleanor paced her small room while the Board of Elders met to discuss Samuel's fate. McCoy had offered to attend the meeting, which was technically open to church members, but Eleanor had declined. She could not bear to sit there while men debated whether her unworthiness made her minister unfit for his position. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Eleanor spent that time alternately praying, crying, and staring out her window at the stars. She thought about Thomas, about the life they had shared and the love that had gradually been consumed by his demons. She thought about the past 6 months of isolation and grief. And she thought about Samuel, about his kindness and courage, about the way he saw her as a person rather than a problem. If the board forced him to choose between his calling and their courtship, what would he do? What should he do? The questions tormented her. Finally, near 10 o'clock, she heard footsteps on the stairs, and then Samuel's voice speaking quietly with Mrs. McCoy. Eleanor's door flew open before she consciously decided to move, and she rushed into the hallway to find Samuel standing there, his face weary but smiling. "I'm still the minister," he said simply. "The vote was 7-3 in my favor." Mr. Larson spoke eloquently about the importance of practicing what we preach. Several other board members agreed that my personal life is my own business, as long as I conduct myself morally, which they agreed I have done. Miss Caldwell's husband was among those who voted against me, along with Mr. Holmes and one other man, but they were outvoted. Eleanor felt her knees go weak with relief. Thank God! Indeed! Samuel stepped closer, though mindful of Mrs. McCoy watching with undisguised interest. Eleanor, I need to ask you something. Through all of this, through every argument, every piece of opposition, have you once doubted that pursuing this courtship was the right choice? She considered the question carefully. Had she doubted? Yes, constantly. Had she been afraid? Absolutely. But had she doubted whether it was right? No, she said slowly. I've been terrified, but I haven't doubted it was right. Neither have I. And that, more than anything else, tells me we're on the correct path. He glanced at Mrs. McCoy. Would it be improper for me to take Mrs. Whitehead for a short walk? With your supervision, of course. Mrs. McCoy snorted. At this hour, the gossips would have a field day. But then again, they're already having a field day, so you might as well do as you please. Go on, both of you. Just stay where I can see you from the porch. They walked out into the cold night air, their breath forming clouds in the darkness. Samuel led her to the front garden, where Miss McCoy grew herbs in the summer, and they stood beneath the bare branches of an old apple tree. I have something to tell you, Samuel said quietly, something that happened during the board meeting. After the vote, Mr. Caldwell stood up and said that even though I had won this battle, I would eventually have to choose between you and my ministry. He said that a minister cannot effectively lead a congregation while courting scandal. Eleanor's stomach clenched. What did you say? I said that if being a minister meant abandoning someone I care about to satisfy the prejudices of others, then I would resign my position today and find other work. I said that my calling is to serve God and people, and I don't believe those two things are in conflict here. And I said that if the good people of Robertson Springs cannot accept their minister, finding love with a good woman, then perhaps they need a different kind of minister than I can be. Eleanor stared at him. You would have given it up? Your calling, your position, everything? For you? Yes, without hesitation. He took her hands in his. Eleanor, I loved being a lawyer, but I gave it up because I found something more important. I love being a minister, but I'll give that up too, if it comes to it. Because some things matter more than careers or reputations, or what other people think. Some things are worth sacrificing for. The tears came then, hot and fast, and Eleanor found herself pulled into Samuel's arms despite propriety and watching neighbors and everything else. He held her while she wept, his hand gentle on her hair, his voice murmuring comfort. I don't deserve you, she said against his chest. We don't love people because they deserve it, he replied. We love them because we can't help it. They stood like that for a long moment before Samuel gently released her, mindful of Mrs. McCoy's presence on the porch. It's late, and you need rest. But Eleanor, I want you to know something. We're going to face more opposition. This isn't over, but we're going to face it together, and we're going to come through it. Do you believe that? She looked up at him, at this man who had risked everything for her, and felt something solidify inside her chest. Yes, she said, I believe it. The days that followed brought a gradual but unmistakable shift in the town's attitude. Samuel continued his pastoral duties with his usual dedication, visiting the sick, counseling the troubled, preaching sermons that challenged and comforted in equal measure. And twice a week he called on Eleanor at the boarding house, where they sat in the parlor under Mrs. McCoy's watchful eye, and talked for hours about everything and nothing. They discussed theology and literature, shared stories from their pasts, debated the best way to make bread and whether winter or summer was superior. They laughed together, sometimes until tears ran down Eleanor's cheeks. They prayed together, haltingly at first, but with growing comfort. And slowly, carefully, they built something that resembled friendship and felt like love. The harvest festival arrived, with clear skies and crisp air that promised the first snow was not far behind. Eleanor had spent the week helping prepare decorations and food, working alongside women who now greeted her with genuine warmth, rather than grudging tolerance. Patterson had become a particular friend, as had two younger women, recent brides who seemed fascinated by Eleanor's emerging romance with the minister. The festival itself was held in a large field behind the church, with long tables groaning under the weight of food contributed by dozens of families. There was music from a local fiddle player, dancing on a wooden platform constructed for the occasion, and games for children. The whole town turned out, from the wealthiest ranchers to the poorest laborers, united in celebration of another year's bounty. Eleanor helped serve food alongside the other women, ladling stew and slicing pie and pouring cider. Samuel moved through the crowd in his ministerial capacity, blessing the meal and greeting families, and settling the occasional dispute between overly competitive children. Their eyes met frequently across the gathering, small moments of connection that felt precious and private, despite the public setting. As evening fell and the dancing began, Samuel appeared at Eleanor's elbow. "Mrs. Whitehead, would you do me the honor of this dance?" The conversations around them quieted. Dancing together would be another public declaration, another line crossed. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. "I would be delighted, Reverend Moseley." He led her to the platform where other couples were already swaying to the fiddle's melody. Samuel's hand settled at her waist, proper, but warm, and they began to move together. Eleanor had not danced since her wedding to Thomas, but her body remembered the steps, and Samuel was an excellent partner, steady and sure. "People are staring," Eleanor murmured. "Let them stare. Let them see that I am proud to be with you, that I'm not ashamed or apologetic about caring for you." He smiled down at her. "Besides, most of them are staring because you look beautiful, not because they disapprove." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. She was wearing the blue dress again, and Miss McCoy had helped her arrange her hair in a softer style. She had not felt beautiful in years, but in Samuel's eyes, she could almost believe it was true. They danced 3 dances together before propriety demanded they separate and dance with others. But Eleanor found herself constantly aware of Samuel's presence, tracking him as he danced with elderly Mrs. Patterson and young Miss Pritchard, and even, with careful courtesy, Mrs. Caldwell herself. The older woman accepted stiffly, and their dance was marked by obvious tension, but Samuel's graciousness never faltered. As the night wore on and the stars emerged brilliant and cold overhead, Eleanor found herself standing at the edge of the gathering, watching the dancers and feeling a contentment she had not known was possible. Mr. Cole appeared beside her, his usual quiet presence somehow comforting. "Evening, Mrs. Whitehead," he said. "Fine festival." "It is," Eleanor agreed. "Are you enjoying yourself, Mr. Cole?" "Well enough. The Larsons asked me to stay on permanent-like. Got myself a room in the bunkhouse and steady wages. Feels good to have a place." "I'm so glad to hear it." Eleanor meant it sincerely. "You deserve stability." "So do you, ma'am." He nodded toward where Samuel stood chatting with a group of ranchers. "That's a good man there. Treats people decent, regardless of who they are." "You could do worse." "I could do far worse," Eleanor agreed softly. "Well, I'll leave you to your evening." Cole tipped his hat and melted back into the crowd, and Eleanor was left alone with her thoughts and the distant sound of fiddle music. She stayed until the families with young children began to depart, until the crowd thinned and the fire burned low. Samuel peered at her side as she was gathering her shawl, preparing to walk back to the boarding house. "May I escort you home?" he asked, offering his arm. They walked through the quiet streets with a comfortable silence between them. Above, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human joy and sorrow, beautiful in their cold distance. Eleanor thought about all the nights she had walked these streets alone, weighted down by grief and isolation, and marveled at how different everything felt now. At the boarding house steps, Samuel paused. "Eleanor, I know we've only been courting for a few weeks, and I know there's still opposition to overcome. But I need you to know something. This isn't a passing fancy or a temporary interest. I'm in this for the long term, however long that takes, and whatever it requires." Eleanor looked up at him, at this man who had changed her life so completely in such a short time. "I'm in this too, Samuel. Scared and uncertain and probably making it all up as I go, but I'm in this." He smiled, that warm expression that made her feel safe and valued and seen. "That's all I need to hear." Winter came to Robertson Springs with sudden ferocity, bringing snow that blanketed the town in white silence, and cold that made everyone huddle closer to their fires. Eleanor's mending business thrived, as people discovered tears and weak seams that needed attention before the worst of the weather set in. She worked long hours by lamplight, her needle flying through fabric, creating small perfections in an imperfect world. Samuel called on her 3 times a week now, their courtship progressing with deliberate slowness that felt both frustrating and appropriate. They talked endlessly, discovering each other's minds and hearts, sharing vulnerabilities and dreams. Sometimes Mrs. McCoy left them alone in the parlor for brief periods, a sign of trust that Eleanor did not take lightly. They never did anything improper during those sullen moments of privacy, but the tension of possibility hung between them, sweet and promising. The church lady's opposition gradually softened as winter deepened. Mrs. Caldwell remained implacable, but even Mrs. Holmes began to offer grudging nods when Eleanor passed. Miss Pritchard actually approached Eleanor one Sunday after service to compliment her dress and asked shyly about her courtship. The young woman seemed genuinely interested rather than judgmental, and Eleanor found herself offering advice about navigating the complicated waters of courtship and community expectations. Christmas approached, bringing with it preparations for special services and celebrations. Eleanor volunteered to help decorate the church and found herself working alongside women who now treated her as one of their own. They asked her opinion on garland placement, shared recipe for holiday baking, invited her to join them for tea and conversation. It was not universal acceptance, not yet, but it was inclusion, and Eleanor treasured it. On Christmas Eve, the church held a candlelight service. Eleanor sat in her usual pew, surrounded by people she was beginning to think of as friends, and listened as Samuel preached about hope and new beginnings, about how the darkest night can give birth to the brightest light. His eyes found hers during the sermon, and the message felt personal, meant for her as much as for the whole congregation. After the service, as people gathered in the fellowship hall for hot cider and cookies, Samuel drew her aside into a quiet corner. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small wrapped package from his pocket. Eleanor's hands trembled as she unwrapped it to reveal a small leather-bound book. She opened it to find blank pages, creamy and inviting. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I thought you might like to have a journal, a place to record your thoughts, your prayers, your dreams for the future." He paused. "Our future, if you'll have it." Eleanor looked up at him, understanding the weight of what he was offering. Not just a journal, but an invitation to imagine future together, to begin recording the story they were writing side by side. "Samuel, you have to answer now," he said gently. "I'm not asking you to marry me tonight, though Lord knows I want to. I'm just asking you to think about it, to consider whether you can imagine building a life with me." Eleanor clutched the journal to her chest, feeling the smooth leather warm under her hands. "I can imagine it," she said quietly. "I've been imagining it for weeks now, even though I was afraid to admit it." His smile was radiant. "Then that's enough for tonight." The new year arrived with bitter cold and heavy snow that kept people close to home. Eleanor spent the long winter evenings working on her mending and writing in the journal Samuel had given her. She wrote about Thomas, about the grief she had carried and was slowly learning to set down. She wrote about Samuel, about the way he made her laugh and challenged her to think differently, and looked at her, the issue were precious. She wrote about hope, tentative and fragile, but growing stronger each day. In late January, Mrs. Caldwell's husband fell ill with pneumonia. The whole town held its breath, knowing that pneumonia in winter was often a death sentence. especially for older men. Samuel visited daily, sitting with the banker and his wife, offering prayer and comfort. And Eleanor, demonstrating the grace that Samuel had taught her, sent over soup and bread, along with a note expressing her hope for Mr. Caldwell's recovery. The banker survived, pulling through after 2 harrowing weeks. And when he was well enough to receive visitors beyond his immediate family and the minister, he asked to see Eleanor. She went nervously, unsure what he wanted, and found him propped up in bed, weak but alert. Mrs. Caldwell sat beside him, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. "Miss Whitehead," the banker said, his voice raspy, "thank you for coming, and thank you for the food you sent. It was very kind of you. I'm glad you're recovering, Miss Caldwell," Eleanor replied carefully. He nodded and glanced at his wife. "My wife has something she wants to say to you." Mrs. Caldwell's face was rigid, but she forced the words out. "I judged you harshly, Mrs. Whitehead. I said cruel things and encouraged others to do the same. While my husband was ill, I had much time to think about mortality and grace, and the kind of person I want to be." Reverend Moseley sat with us every day. Eleanor stood frozen, hardly believing what she was hearing. Mrs. Caldwell, the architect of so much of her suffering, was apologizing. "I accept your apology," Eleanor said quietly, "and I'm truly glad your husband is recovering. Will you forgive me?" Mrs. Caldwell asked, and now tears were streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I don't deserve it, but I'm asking anyway." Eleanor thought about all the whispered cruelties, all the deliberate cuts and casual condemnations. She thought about how easy it would be to hold on to resentment, to nurse the hurt and use it as a shield. But she also thought about Samuel's sermons on grace, about how forgiveness was not about deserving, but about choosing to release the burden of bitterness. "I forgive you," Eleanor said, and was surprised to find she meant it. "We all make mistakes, Mrs. Caldwell. What matters is that we try to do better." After she left the Caldwell home, Eleanor walked through the snowy streets feeling lighter than she had in months. The weight of Miss Caldwell's opposition had been heavier than she realized, and releasing it felt like setting down a stone she had been carrying for far too long. She went directly to the small house behind the church and knocked on Samuel's door. He answered in his shirt sleeves, surprise and pleasure lighting his face. "Eleanor, what's wrong?" "Is everything all right?" "Everything is wonderful," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "May I come in?" He stepped aside immediately, and Eleanor entered the familiar warmth of his home. She turned to face him, words tumbling out in a rush. "Mrs. Caldwell apologized to me. She actually apologized. And Samuel, I forgave her, and it felt like flying. Like something that had been chained inside me broke free, and I could finally breathe properly." Samuel's smile was tender. "That's what forgiveness does. It doesn't excuse what was done, but it releases us from being defined by it. I understand that now, and I understand something else too." Eleanor stepped closer to him, her heart pounding. "I've been so afraid of moving forward, so worried about what it meant to care for you, while Thomas's memory was still fresh. But I realized today that holding on to my grief isn't honoring Thomas. It's just keeping me trapped in the past. And Thomas, whatever his demons, would never have wanted that for me." Samuel's expression grew serious, intent. "What are you saying, Eleanor?" "I'm saying that I love you." The words came out in a whisper, but they felt like shouting. "I love the way you see people, the way you defend the defenseless, the way you make me feel like I matter. I love your wisdom and your kindness, and the way you challenge me to be braver than I think I can be. And I'm tired of being afraid of that love." For a long moment, Samuel simply stared at her, his eyes bright with emotion. Then he closed the distance between them and took her face gently in his hands. "Eleanor Whitehead, I have loved you since the day I heard you weeping behind those flour sacks in the general store. I loved your courage in the face of cruelty, your grace under pressure, your determination to keep going, even when everything seemed hopeless. I love you completely and without reservation, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you just how loved you are." "Then ask me," Eleanor whispered. "Ask me what you've been waiting to ask." Samuel's hands trembled slightly against her face. "Eleanor, Will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my companion for whatever time God grants us? Will you build a life with me, face opposition with me, find joy with me? Yes, Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face. Yes to all of it. Yes to everything. He kissed her then, gentle and reverent, a promise and a celebration all at once. Eleanor felt herself melt into him, felt years of loneliness and pain dissolving in the warmth of his embrace. This was not the desperate passion of youth, but something deeper, richer, built on understanding and choice and hard-won trust. When they finally drew apart, both were laughing and crying at the same time. "We should tell Mrs. McCoy," Eleanor said. "She's vulnerable when she finds out she was right all along. Let her be insufferable. She's earned it." Samuel kept his arms around Eleanor, as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. "When shall we marry?" "I want to say tomorrow, but I suppose we should be practical." "Spring," Eleanor said decisively. "When the world is coming back to life and everything is new. That feels right." They announced their engagement the following Sunday after the service. Samuel made the announcement from the pulpit, his voice steady and proud, and the congregation erupted in applause and cheers. Mrs. Caldwell was among those applauding, her face serene rather than disapproving. Mrs. Larson immediately began planning a wedding celebration. Even Holmes approached Eleanor afterward to offer congratulations, though her smile was somewhat stiff. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparations. Eleanor worked on her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation, in soft cream rather than white. Mrs. McCoy insisted on hosting a wedding shower, inviting women from throughout the community. The event was held in the boarding house parlor, crowded and warm and filled with laughter. Women brought gifts of linens and dishes, practical items for setting up a household. They shared advice, some helpful and some ridiculous, about marriage and managing a home and keeping a husband happy. During a quiet moment, Mrs. Patterson pulled Eleanor aside. "I want you to know how much your courage has meant to me," she said quietly. "Watching you stand up to the gossips, watching you refuse to be shamed into hiding, it gave me courage too. I've started speaking up more in church meetings, sharing my opinions even when I know they might not be popular. You showed me that we don't have to accept other people's definitions of who we are." Eleanor embraced her, moved by the words. "We show each other courage," she said. "That's how a community's supposed to work." Mr. Cole approached her after church one Sunday with a wrapped package. "Wedding present," he said gruffly. "Nothing fancy, but I thought you might like it." Inside was a beautifully carved wooden box with Eleanor's initials on the lid. "For keeping special things," he explained. "Letters, mementos, that sort of thing. I made it myself." Eleanor ran her fingers over the smooth wood, touched by the care evident in every detail. "It's beautiful, Mr. Cole. Thank you. You gave me hope when I needed it," he said simply. "Seemed right to give you something back." As winter slowly loosened its grip, and the first hints of spring appeared in the greening grass and budding trees, Eleanor felt her own life blossoming in parallel. The town that had once seemed so hostile now felt like home. She had friends, work that fulfilled her, and a future that gleamed with promise. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in April, when the wildflowers would be blooming and the weather mild enough for an outdoor celebration. Samuel wanted to marry her in the church garden, surrounded by new growth and the beauty of creation. Eleanor agreed wholeheartedly, touched by the symbolism. The night before the wedding, Eleanor sat in her little room under the eaves for the last time, writing in the journal Samuel had given her. She wrote about the journey that had brought her to this moment, about Thomas and grief and survival. She wrote about Samuel and love and new beginnings. And she wrote about grace, that mysterious force that had carried her through the darkness and delivered her into light. Mrs. McCoy knocked and entered without waiting, carrying 2 cups of tea. She settled her bulk onto the edge of Eleanor's narrow bed and handed over one of the cups. "Nervous? Terrified," Eleanor admitted, "but also more certain than I've ever been about anything." "That's how you know it's real." Mrs. McCoy sipped her tea. "I want you to know something, girl. When you first came to me asking for a room, you were so broken I wasn't sure you'd survive. But you did more than survive. You found a way to thrive. You should be proud of that. I couldn't have done it without you, without your kindness and support, when I had nothing and no one. Oh, hush. I just gave you a room. You did the hard work yourself. Mrs. McCoy's eyes were suspiciously bright. But I'm going to miss having you here. This place is going to feel empty without you. I'm only moving to the minister's house. I'll still see you all the time. It won't be the same, but that's all right. Change is how we know we're still alive. McCoy set down her cup and pulled Eleanor into a rough embrace. Be happy, Eleanor. You've earned it 1,000 times over. A wedding day dawned clear and beautiful. The sky a brilliant blue scattered with cotton-white clouds. Eleanor dressed in her cream-colored gown, with Mrs. McCoy and Miss Patterson helping with buttons and hairpins, and the simple veil she had fashioned from lace. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. This Eleanor had color in her cheeks and light in her eyes, looked full of life and hope, rather than merely enduring. The church garden had been transformed into something magical. Garlands of spring flowers hung from the trees. Chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing an arch covered in climbing roses, just beginning to bloom, and the whole space seemed to glow with possibility. The entire town had turned out, filling the chairs and spilling onto the grass beyond. As Eleanor walked down the makeshift aisle on Miss Patterson's arm, since she had no father or brother to perform the duty, she saw faces that had once been hostile, now smiling with genuine warmth. She saw Miss Caldwell dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. She saw Mr. Cole standing at the back, his weathered face creased with pleasure. She saw Mrs. Larson and Miss McCoy and all the others who had stood by her when standing by her cost something. But mostly she saw Samuel waiting at the altar, his face radiant with joy and love. He was dressed in his best suit, his silver-threaded hair gleaming in the sunlight, and the way he looked at her made Eleanor feel like the most beautiful, most cherished woman in the world. The ceremony was simple, but profound. Reverend Hayes from the neighboring town performed the service, since Samuel could hardly marry himself. They exchanged vows they had written together, promises of faithfulness and partnership, of facing joy and sorrow side by side, of building something lasting from the broken pieces of their pasts. When Samuel slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, Eleanor felt the last of her fears dissolve. This was right. This was real. This was grace made visible. You may kiss your bride, Reverend Hayes announced with a smile, and Samuel did so, thoroughly and joyfully, to the cheers and applause of everyone gathered. The celebration that followed was filled with music and dancing, and more food than Eleanor had seen in one place since arriving in Robertson Springs. Samuel danced with her again and again, and between dances he introduced her to everyone as his wife, with such obvious pride that Eleanor's cheeks hurt from smiling. As evening approached and the celebration began to wind down, Samuel and Eleanor slipped away from the crowd, walking hand in hand toward the small house that was now their home. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and the spring air carried the scent of flowers and fresh earth. Happy? Samuel asked, squeezing her hand. More than I ever thought possible, Eleanor replied honestly. Samuel, a year ago, I was sitting in that general store listening to women destroy my reputation, feeling like my life was over. And now look at me. Look at us. Grace has a way of surprising us, Samuel said, of taking our darkest moments and transforming them into something beautiful. They stood on the porch of their home, looking back at the church, where they had just been married, and Eleanor thought about all the twists and turns that had brought her to this moment, the loss and pain. Yes, but also the courage and kindness, the small acts of defiance, and the gradual building of something new. Why did you do it? Eleanor asked, the question she had pondered for so long finally finding voice again. That day in the store, when you defended me, why did you risk so much for someone you barely knew? Samuel was quiet for a moment, considering. I suppose because I saw myself in you. I saw someone who was suffering unjustly, who was being judged without mercy, and I remembered what that felt like when I lost Catherine. I remembered how people treated me, how they had opinions about my grief and my choices, how they felt entitled to pass judgment on things they didn't understand. He turned to face her fully. But more than that, I saw you, not a scandal or a problem, but a person, a woman of strength and dignity, who deserved better than what she was receiving, and I couldn't stay silent. It would have been a betrayal of everything I claimed to believe. Eleanor reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines that care and laughter had etched there. You gave me my life back, my dignity, my hope, my future. How do I ever thank you for that? You already have. Every day you choose to be with me, every time you smile, every moment of happiness we share, that's thanks enough. He kissed her palm. We saved each other, Eleanor. That's what love does. They went inside their home as the stars began to emerge overhead, closing the door on their wedding day and opening it on their married life. And Eleanor, who had once thought she would spend the rest of her days alone and grieving, felt a gratitude so profound, it was almost like prayer. The months and years that followed brought their share of challenges. There were still people in Robertson Springs who disapproved of their marriage, who thought Eleanor unworthy or Samuel's judgment flawed. There were difficult conversations and awkward social situations, and moments when the weight of others' expectations felt crushing. But there was also joy, abundant and overflowing. There were quiet evenings by the fire, talking and laughing and simply being together. There were Sunday mornings when Eleanor sat in the front pew and listened to her husband preach with pride swelling in her chest. There were community gatherings where she was welcomed and included, where her opinions mattered and her presence was valued. Eleanor continued her mending work, building a reputation throughout the county for skilled and careful repairs. Samuel continued his ministry, becoming known as a man who practiced what he preached, who stood up for the marginalized and challenged the comfortable. Together, they became a team, partners in every sense of the word, supporting each other through difficulties and celebrating each other's triumphs. Mrs. McCoy became a regular visitor to their home, treating their parlor as an extension of her own, and offering advice on everything, whether asked for or not. Mr. Cole eventually married a widow from the Larson Ranch, a quiet woman who seemed to understand his reserved nature. Mrs. Caldwell never became a close friend, but she treated Eleanor with respect and even defended her once when a newcomer to town began spreading gossip. The transformation was not complete, but it was real. 5 years after their wedding, Eleanor stood in the church garden on a spring morning, very like the one when she had married Samuel. But this time, she held a small child in her arms, a daughter with Samuel's gray eyes and Eleanor's dark hair. The baby gurgled and reached for the flowers, and Eleanor felt her heart expand with a love she had not known was possible. Samuel appeared beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. "There are my two favorite people in the world," he said, kissing first the baby's head and then Eleanor's cheek. "She's going to be spoiled rotten," Eleanor said, but she was smiling. "McCoy has already made her 3 new dresses, and the Larsons sent over enough baby clothes for triplets. Let her be spoiled. After everything we went through to get here, a little spoiling seems perfectly appropriate." Samuel took the baby from Eleanor's arms and held her up, making her laugh. "Besides, our little Grace deserves all the love this community can give her." Grace. They had named her Grace because that's what she represented, the culmination of all the grace that had carried them through their darkest times and delivered them into joy. Eleanor watched her husband play with their daughter and thought about how far they had come, how much had changed since that day in the general store when Samuel had first defended her honor. People asked her sometimes about those early days, about how she had survived the gossip and cruelty, about what advice she would give to others facing similar struggles. Eleanor always said the same thing, that courage looks like showing up even when you're terrified, that grace often comes through other people's kindness, that redemption is possible even when everything seems lost. But mostly, she talked about love, about how love had found her when she least expected it, how it had given her the strength to keep fighting, how it had transformed not just her life, but an entire community's understanding of mercy and second chances. She talked about how one person's courage to stand up for what's right can create ripples that spread farther than anyone imagines, changing hearts and minds, and making space for others to be brave as well. The church ladies who had once said horrific things about her learned, slowly as sometimes painfully, that judgment is easy but compassion is transformative. Some of them changed completely, becoming advocates for grace rather than gatekeepers of respectability. Others remained set in their ways, but at least learned to keep their cruelty to themselves. And a few, like Mrs. Caldwell, found genuine transformation, discovering that admitting wrong and seeking forgiveness could free them from the prison of their own righteousness. As for why Samuel had defended Eleanor's honor that day in the general store, the answer was both simple and profound. He had done it because it was right, because silence in the face of injustice is complicity, because every person deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. He had done it because he believed in the grace he preached, and because he saw in Eleanor not a scandal, but a woman worthy of protection and respect. But he had also done it because sometimes, though we don't know it at the time, we defend others in order to save ourselves. In standing up for Eleanor, Samuel had reminded himself of who he wanted to be, what his calling truly meant. He had chosen compassion over comfort, truth over popularity, love over fear. And in making that choice, he had not only rescued Eleanor from the cruelty of gossip, but had also rescued himself from becoming the kind of minister who valued reputation more than righteousness. On a warm summer evening, many years after their wedding, Eleanor and Samuel sat on their porch, watching the sunset over Robertson Springs. Their daughter Grace was inside, practicing piano with more enthusiasm than skill. The sound drifted through the open windows, slightly off-key but heartfelt, and Samuel smiled at Eleanor's mock grimace. "She's improving," he said loyally. "She's enthusiastic," which is not quite the same thing, Eleanor replied, but her tone was affectionate. "Still, I suppose enthusiasm is more important than perfection." "That could be the motto of our entire life together," Samuel said, "enthusiastic and imperfect, but always authentic." Eleanor took his hand, these hands that had held hers through so many moments of joy and difficulty, that had wiped her tears and lifted her burdens, and worked alongside her to build something beautiful from broken pieces. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Defending me that day, knowing what it would cost you?" Samuel turned to her, his expression serious. "Eleanor, defending you that day was the best decision I ever made, second only to asking you to marry me. It cost me some friendships and some comfort, yes, but it gave me integrity, purpose, and you. That's not a trait I would ever regret. I love you," Eleanor said simply, "for that day and every day since, for seeing me when I felt invisible, for standing beside me when everyone else walked away, for showing me that life could hold joy again." "I love you too," Samuel replied, "for your courage, your grace, your refusal to let bitterness destroy you, for teaching me that redemption is not just something we preach about, but something we live every day." As the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars appeared, Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought her here. From the depths of grief and isolation to this moment of contentment and belonging, from being the town scandal to being the minister's beloved wife, and a respected member of the community, from brokenness to wholeness. It had not been easy or quick or without pain, but it had been real, and it had been worth it. The church ladies had said horrific things about her once, had tried to destroy her with their words and their judgment. But a good man had defended her honor, not because he wanted anything from her, but because it was right. And from that single act of courage, everything else had followed. Love and healing, transformation and grace, redemption and new life. Some people spend their whole lives wondering if grace is real, if redemption is possible, if love can truly overcome darkness. Eleanor knew the answer. She lived it every day in this small town, in this modest home, with this good man beside her, and this hopeful future stretching ahead. Grace was real. Redemption was possible. Love could and did overcome darkness, one brave choice at a time. And that, Eleanor thought, as Samuel squeezed her hand, and their daughter's piano practice finally stumbled to a conclusion, was the truest story she knew. Not a fairy tale where everything came easily, but a real story of real people, choosing courage and kindness, even when it cost them something. A story of community slowly learning that judgment destroys, but grace transforms. A story of two broken people finding wholeness together and offering that wholeness to others. The kind of story worth telling, worth remembering, worth living. The kind of story that reminded everyone who heard it that even in our darkest moments, even when the voices of condemnation seem overwhelming, grace is still possible. Love is still available. New beginnings are still within reach. We just have to be brave enough to accept them when they're offered, and brave enough to offer them to others in turn. Eleanor rose from her chair and extended her hand. "Samuel, come inside," she said. "Grace needs an audience for her concert, and we need to make sure she practices the right notes as enthusiastically as she's been practicing the wrong ones." Samuel laughed and let her pull him to his feet. Together they walked into their home, into the warm light, then the sound of their daughter's music, into the ordinary sacred moments that made up their extraordinary ordinary life. And behind them, the stars emerged one by one over Robertson Springs, bearing witness to grace, to love, to the quiet miracles that happen when people choose courage over fear and compassion over judgment. This was their story. This was their life. And it was very, very good.